those who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, my name's Eric Wilkin. I'm the creative marketing director at Lightfully Behavioral Health. And today my co-host is Shelley Cambodge, who is our National Director of Outreach. And we want to welcome you today to today's continuing education event called Lighting the Way, Interventions for Teens and Their Families in Navigating Teen Suicide Risk. And first, if you happen to have any technical issues during today's call, please reach out via email to Shelley. We will pop in her email into the chat here right now, so you have it. And before we start the main presentation, I want to share some quick updates about our services at Lightfully. And if you're not familiar with Lightfully yet, we specialize in primary mental health services, serving both adults 18 plus and adolescents 12 to 17. Our programs are gender inclusive, and we welcome clients of all identities across our locations in LA, San Diego, Thousand Oaks, and San Jose. And we really do pride ourselves on making quality mental health care accessible through extensive insurance coverage, high single case agreement rates, and clinical excellence. I'm particularly excited also to share some additions we made recently, including virtual PHP with integrated psychiatric services. This expansion does allow us to reach more clients while maintaining the high standard of psychiatric oversight that these clients need. We also now provide targeted treatment for schizoaffective disorder, and our approach tackles the unique combination of mood symptoms and psychosis, really empowering individuals to manage symptoms and move towards a more balanced and fulfilling life. Also, for those clients who might be hesitant to a higher level of care or need a more flexible option, we do have what's called our short-term option. And this offers intensive support across all levels of care, residential all the way to virtual, starting in convenient 2-week blocks. It also complements existing outpatient treatment during high stress periods of life so they can continue coming to outpatient therapy. And it also provides support through daily groups, individual therapy, family sessions. All of these are led by our compassionate clinical experts. So if you think it sounds like something that might be a good fit for a client of yours, our admissions team is ready to chat with you and make that transition as smooth as possible. So, okay, on to some logistics. For reference, we are recording today's presentation and it will be available online afterward. And we'll address any questions you might have during a short Q&A session at the end. So as questions come up throughout the presentation, please save them for the end of the presentation to pop them into the chat, just so they don't get lost as the presentation goes on. It is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Nicole Siegfried, Lightfully's Chief Clinical Officer. She brings over 2 decades of mental health treatment experience and serves as an adjunct assistant professor of psychology at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Her expertise spans eating disorders, mental health, and suicide prevention, with numerous publications and international speaking engagements to her credit. Her unwavering belief in recovery and dedication to helping individuals build lives worth living has really shaped our approach at Lightfully. So without further ado, Nicole, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. So glad that you could spend some time with us today. I'm going to start sharing. First of all, like I said, thank you for being here today. So glad for you to spend some time with us. And I always start with, the idea of on a Friday afternoon talking about a very dark topic in many ways. I'm sure is not necessarily the way you want to spend your Friday. But I always say that my goal in this is that people will leave this presentation with a sense of hope, a sense of renewed confidence, or new confidence in treating clients who are struggling in this way. So I will go ahead and get started. I first want to make sure that you have access to all of the handouts. So this is a QR code that you can snap with a little pic with your camera, and this takes you to all of the handouts and resources that I'll be referencing today. I will also make that available again at the end of the presentation, so you'll have another chance to get access to this if you miss it at the beginning. It's whenever I attend a presentation, I always like to have a little goodie bag of interventions to take back to working with my clients right away. So I hope this is useful to you, and it will also include the slide deck of today's presentation. So what we're going to start with today is, first, let me just give an overview of the things we'll cover. So we'll start with describing the suicidal mind. I always say this is one of the most important aspects of the presentation. It's very difficult for people to understand the factors that come together to place a person at risk and to get to the point where they feel that their death is worth more than their life and that life isn't worth living. And so really understanding that as much as we can and putting ourselves in the team's shoes or client's shoes is an important aspect of this work. Then we'll move into the family safety and stabilization plan. I'm hoping that you all will feel like this is a really useful tool that you can use with your teens. We also have a version that we use with adults. So this is a very flexible, applicable plan that can meet the needs of any age group if you make some adjustments. The third part of the presentation will be focused on utilizing emotion-focused family therapy skills to help families support their teen. These skills are good, though, for anyone. We train all of our staff in these skills because these are ways for us to support and show empathy for clients and to move out of problem-solving mode and into empathy mode. And then we'll talk about how we apply interventions and integrate a variety of evidence-based interventions based on the needs of the teen client in terms of what drives their suicidality. So we have a chock full presentation for today. Like I said, I really hate those presentations. I've been to many presentations on suicide in my career. I hate the ones that use scare tactics and vomit out a bunch of stats at you that leaves you quaking in your tracks. That is not going to be this presentation. I do like to start off, though, with a little bit of a lay of the land, just so that we know what we are looking at in terms of our teen population. So for our teens, suicide is the second leading cause of death among U.S. youth and young adults ages 15 to 24. Now, don't get confused here. The reason it's so high is that teens are much less likely to die by other natural causes. So actually, if you had an elderly male in front of you and a teen male in front of you, the elderly male actually is at higher risk. That age group is at higher risk than our youth. But in terms of leading causes of death, suicide ranks higher because in our elderly age groups, obviously people are more likely to die by a heart attack or a stroke and that kind of thing. So teen suicide rates differ by gender. And so young men are more likely to die by suicide, and young women are more likely to attempt suicide. And that's because individuals who identify as male are more likely to use lethal means. And so Females are more likely to use less lethal means like overdose, for instance. And so that's one of the reasons that accounts for this difference in genders. I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to what causes suicide. Suicide rates have been on the rise over the last several years. And these data are always a little bit delayed. So this just goes to 2020, 2021. And some of the factors that, and the reason those are delayed is because they're delayed coming out of the National Center for Health Statistics by a couple of years. But the reason for the rise in suicide rates is mixed, or some of the theories that go into that. Even though one theory is that even though we are more connected than ever in terms of social media, electronics, in many ways, these are thought of as somewhat artificial connections, and sometimes can create a sense of loneliness and disconnectedness that may be one of the factors that is increasing this risk that we'll talk about in a little bit. So let's talk about families. So there's a strong evidence base for the impact of families in moving the needle, so to speak, in decreasing suicide risk in teens. In moving the needle in decreasing depressive symptoms. However, there is less research around family interventions as it relates to suicide specifically. There is some preliminary data that suggests that family involvement does improve response to treatment, but most teen therapies don't have a formalized approach to family integration. So this is an area that we've found in working with our teens that we didn't have a lot of evidence base to choose from. What we also know is that families often don't really understand suicide. And this isn't something that we come equipped with as family members or parents in how to talk to your teen who is suicidal. And so we do the best we can, but often it lands flat or sometimes creates more friction in that relationship. So part of the work that we do is really to improve that family understanding and improve those language and skills for our families. So here are some interventions that have a strong evidence base for suicidality in teens. DBT for adolescents has been shown to decrease suicide risk. CBT, mentalization, attachment-based family therapy have also been identified as evidence-based interventions. And the CAMS approach, which is what we use here at Lightfully, which is David Job's approach to decreasing suicide risk. There is a teen version of this approach. So I will be referencing some of this today. I get no kickback from David Jobs or the CAMS approach. So when I'm recommending this, this is just based on my own experience of being trained in this. And it's a very solid training that is at a reasonable price, and it's virtual, and it includes role play and consultation hours if you're interested in getting more practice or more expertise in this area. And there is a teen version that is an advanced application of the CAMS approach. All right. So let's start with, like I said, what I consider the most important aspect of really doing this work for us as clinicians and as our helping our families understand this as well. So I started, let me back up a little bit. I started working and specializing in suicide really as a function of need, whatever that saying is, that uh, what is it? I just lost the saying, that necessity is the mother of invention or something like that. But I was working with clients with suicide. I was working with clients with eating disorders and found myself really at a loss in how to meet their needs in terms of suicidality. I was trained old school. So some of you who were trained in the 90s as well may have had this as part of your training, which was I was trained how to identify suicide risk, but then send someone to the hospital if they were suicidal. And really that was looked at as the treatment. And it really was very simplified in that we thought, send someone to the hospital, my work is done, they will get that all fixed, they'll come back to me, and then I'm going to do work on their eating disorder, which is really the focus of why they're here. And I really had found that this was inadequate in treating our clients. Our clients really struggled with chronic suicidal ideation, and when they came back, were still struggling. They may have been able to create safety, but they weren't able to create a life worth living. And so I started in the 2000s really getting more training in this area so that I could develop an expertise myself. And that is what drove me to really specialize in this area. And what I'd found is that many of us, because we were so fearful of a client dying by suicide, in fact, it's one of the greatest fears of any clinician, is the most feared presentation is suicidality. We kind of avoid that topic altogether. We just, complete the training so we can check them off for our CEUs, but we really avoid digging deep because it's fearful, or it causes fear for us, and it's scary. And so a lot of clinicians I've found, including myself early on, really lacked the expertise and the competence in this area based on our own fear. So that fear blocks us often from really the most important aspect of working with these clients, which is meeting them where they are, understanding the suicidal experience, and providing empathy and connection. So let's start with that here. So, like I said, most important slide. So how do we understand the suicidal mind? Many of us on this call may have struggled with our own suicidality, so we can put ourselves in the shoes of our clients. Others of us haven't. And so it doesn't make sense to us how someone can get to the point of believing that the pain of living is worse than enduring the pain of dying. We are wired as humans to live, to protect ourselves, and to go against that innate evolutionary protection. Really, something has to align in terms of the moon, the sun, and the stars to make us go against that innate protection. In fact, this is somewhat morbid, but one of the ways that murders and suicide are differentiated is that there is something called hesitation wounds with suicide, because it is often the case that even up to the last minute, individuals are working up the courage to do this. It's against their innate drive to live. And so this is something, like I said, that we are not wired to do. So what happens? Well, the first thing that we need to understand is a concept called psychache. I love this term. So this term was coined by Ed Schneidman, who's the father of suicidology. Some of you who have gotten training in suicide may be familiar with the American Association of Suicidology. If you aren't, I highly recommend getting on their website, joining, attending their conference. It's a beautiful conference in many ways because it has an academic portion, but also a lived experience portion. And so many people who have lost someone to suicide attend this conference. Many people who have had a history of suicide attempts, suicide survivors attend the conference. And so I highly recommend it if you haven't ever attended it. So Ed Schneiman was the founder of the AAS, and he felt like we were at a loss for a term that really describes the cognitive, emotional, physical, even pain that is associated with suicide. So he coined a term himself, which is called psychache. And this describes the ruminative thought that is swirling with suicidality, in addition to the heartache and the emotional pain that is associated as well. You'll often see clients who are struggling with suicidality with their hands on their head like this, kind of almost rocking also with the emotional pain, because the ruminative thought is torture. The thoughts are on a cycle of you must die, you should kill yourself, nothing else is important. And so it is exhausting and torturous to be in that thought cycle. So I often give teens even this term to describe the experience that they have going on, to give them a language of what it is they're experiencing, because words never really, the words that we have never really do it justice. Those who die by suicide, when we talk about the sun and the moon and the stars aligning, those factors that converge to place a person at risk are three factors. This comes from Thomas Joyner, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But these three factors are burdensomeness, disconnection, and a sense of fearlessness around death. Those are the three factors that come together to place a person at risk. So I'll talk more about that in a minute. The other thing we need to understand is that our adaptive processes go awry somewhat in the process of suicidality. So we experience something called constricted thinking. Constricted thinking is an adaptive phenomenon in high risk situations or emergency dangerous situations. So I always give an example. If a bear were to come in, I need to switch my animal, because I never know what you're actually supposed to do with a bear. And I always say I'm going to look it up. But anyway, let's say a bear comes in my office right now, God forbid. I would just focus on this bear. Everything else would go to the periphery, drift to the periphery, and I'd forget that I was doing this presentation, that you were here. Nothing else would matter. I would just focus on that bear. That is adaptive. And when we are in a suicidal state, the same thing happens. Everything else drifts to the periphery, and all we can focus on is dying. That is the only thing that we can see. And the horizon of opportunities that everyone else sees in your life are not available to us, because we just have the immediate situation. So in this case, if we think about a bear, we'd just be focused on that bear. So I think about too, the other example that I use with this is I give an analogy of 9/11 actually. If you haven't ever visited the 9/11 Museum in New York, I highly recommend it. I visited it several years ago at this point, but there is an art installation there where it has pictures. It always gives me a chill, but it has pictures of people who had jumped to their deaths. And these individuals did not die by suicide. They were going to die. They were just choosing the route by which they were going to die. And so they had blown up the pictures of these people jumping to their deaths. So it was either that or be burned alive. And when I was in that very poignant um, uh, art installation, I thought about other clients who, that I've worked with who have made jumps and that kind of thing, and what they were thinking of. Was it similar to what these individuals were thinking that day? And I realized that our clients who are struggling with suicidality often may feel similar to the way that these individuals felt in this burning building. Our clients feel like there is no option. It almost feels as though being burned alive in the pain of living, or dying, maybe a painful death, but at least escaping on the other side. And they see no other way out. Their vision is constricted or restricted to where this seems like the only option. And what is so tragic for us as clinicians or family members is that we see the whole building. We see there is a way out. We see that there are exits. And so often with our clients who are struggling with this, I use this analogy to say, this is when you're feeling suicidal. It's the worst time to kill yourself. That's a little bit tongue in cheek, but you're not seeing things clearly. So this is when you have to rely on other people who have a map of the building, and they may see a way out, even though you don't. Your vision is smoke, is filled with smoke, and you can't see the exit, but other people can. So that is something that can be helpful in sharing with clients so that they know in those high suicidal times that they are experiencing constricted thinking. Something else that I think is important for families is that we really miss the boat when we think of suicide attempts as attention seeking. I'll have clinicians say this sometimes. Often I think of it as a time when they're really more burned out themselves and maybe struggling with compassion fatigue. It's protective for us to think that these are attention seeking, because there's part of us that's like, oh, it's just for attention. Nothing bad's really going to happen. But by utilizing that conceptualization, we're missing the most effective intervention for suicidality, which is connection. And so when we're brushing off an attempt as attention seeking, we actually are missing an intervention. We also may be minimizing risk because we say, oh, she's done this 7, 8 times. It's just for attention. She doesn't really mean it. But what we know is that multiple suicide attempts is the number one risk factor for a completed suicide, especially if each of those sort of ups the ante in terms of lethality. So we really, when we have that reaction, we are human. We may have the reaction. Families are human. They may have the reaction. We need to look inside a little bit to say, what do we really mean by attention seeking? I mean, it may be connection seeking or help seeking, and that may be a better way to think of it. Also, when families, again, I think from a place of fear, may think of suicide as selfish. And so they may float that out to their loved one oftentimes, like, this is so selfish. Do you not know what this would do to your dad and me if you killed yourself? Like, think about everyone else. And this also misses the mark or misses the boat, because in that suicidal state, clients, teens are thinking this is the least selfish thing they can do, that their death is worth more than their life. And they might be saying, when their family members say that to them, they may be saying in their head, yeah, you'd be sad for a little while, but in the long run, you wouldn't have to deal with all the trouble that I'm causing. And so when we think of suicide as selfish, that's another place where we may want to pause and look internally as to what's activating that for us. So I talked about the factors that place a person at risk for suicide. So this is Thomas Joiner's theory of suicide, the interpersonal theory of suicide. And what Joiner says is that three factors converge to place a person at risk. Some of you may be familiar with Thomas Joiner. He wrote Why People Die by Suicide. It has a very unique perspective on suicide. He has, this is his area of expertise, as a leading suicidologist. But his father also died by suicide while he was in graduate school studying depression. His father died by suicide. So he really was interested in what happened, with my dad, that he got to this point, because it wasn't something that we really saw coming as a family. So he has that lived experience as a family member who has a loved one who died, and then also the academic lens. And so his work points to three factors that place a person at risk. The first is burdensomeness. And we talk about this a lot in terms of people who are suicidal feeling like they are a burden. And there's sort of that classic burdensomeness that we see oftentimes, which is that my death is worth more than my life isn't worth living, people would be better off without me. But it can also take on, what I say, some other flavors. So the burdensomeness can also look like psychache. So carrying the burden of that emotional pain, that heaviness of just trudging, sludging through life with that psychache on a day-by-day basis becomes intolerable. So that's a way that we can think of as burdensome. We can think of burdensomeness as well. Another way that I see it show up in clients, not as much for our teens, but sometimes our adults who've had a history of severe trauma, and they've carried that load for a long time, and they kind of see what's in front of them, in terms of continued treatment, and there doesn't really seem like there's hope on the other side. That can feel very burdensome. And so that's another way burdensomeness can show up. The second factor is what Joiner refers to as thwarted belongingness. I always smile with this because I've never had a client say, I think I'm experiencing thwarted belongingness. What they'll say is, I feel disconnected, I feel unknown, unseen, misunderstood. And that really shows up for our teens. In terms of their peers, in terms of their family. And so this is an area of disconnection plays a big role for our teen clients. And then the third factor is a combo. And this factor is a combination of pain tolerance and fearlessness around death. So to kill yourself, for a person to kill themselves, they have to be able to develop a tolerance to pain so that they can go through with this. They also have to develop a fearlessness around death. So the picture that I have here is actually, this is an oligometer that measures pain tolerance. So in some of the research that we've done with Joiner's team in his lab, we've measured pain tolerance as a predictor of suicide attempts. And so this is a proxy for pain tolerance. It measures pressure. to get a rating of the amount of pain that someone can withstand. And there's other ways they've done this as well, through like a cold presser that's similar to the cold plunge, but just with your arm, to measure pain tolerance. So that combo of pain tolerance and fearlessness around death, it really is the tipping point, the tipping factor into suicide risk. So I'll talk about what that is in a minute. So these three factors come together to place a person at risk for a serious suicide attempt or a death by suicide. So let's look at it in more of a model form. So what we see over here on the left side is a desire for suicide. And you see that these bubbles are bigger. The desire for suicide, which often includes suicidal ideation, is more common in clients. We'll see this in many of our clients who are struggling with depression and maybe other psychiatric disorders. And so this is where the burdensomeness and thwarted belongingness live. So people may say, with this desire for suicide, the reason they want to die or think they should die is that they're a burden to everyone. Nobody, wants to deal with this anymore, and nobody gets them. They feel really disconnected. There's no reason to keep going. My life isn't worth living. So that's the desire side. There's a good portion of people who may experience this desire. The other side of the coin, you see that this is a smaller bubble. This is an acquired capacity for lethality, which includes those two factors: fearlessness around death and pain tolerance. So this group of people who are capable of suicide is a smaller group. But when those people who are capable of suicide, when that overlaps with the desire, that's where you see this increased risk for a lethal attempt or death by suicide. So let's talk about what this acquired capacity for lethality means and what that looks like. So I often ask a riddle at this point, which is, what do military veterans, veterinarians, and people with eating disorders have in common? So on the surface, it would look like not much, right? But what they have in common is that they have high rates of suicide, but underneath that high rate of suicide, they have a high acquired capacity for lethality. And you're like, wait, what? Let's start with military veterans. That one makes sense. Think of people who've been at death's door in different ways. And so these individuals are up close and personal with death, might be on the front lines, that kind of thing. So you can understand where they've acquired a lethality, where they may have an increased pain tolerance, and death has lost its sting, so to speak. They're sort of desensitized around death. So that may be the way they develop this capability of suicide. When we think about veterinarians, that one has a question mark. These are very gentle people. My son is a veterinarian. But when we think about them being up close and personal with death, they are on a day-by-day basis by putting animals to sleep. Also, physicians, anesthesiologists, for instance, have a higher rate of suicide. So they're up close and personal with death on a daily basis as well. When we think about veterinarians, eating disorders, by virtue of the symptoms of their eating disorder, they're up close and personal with death. And so they develop a capacity for lethality. Many clients with eating disorders will say, I've been told 4 times over at this point that I should have died with my potassium being that low. They're engaging in very violent behaviors in terms of purging, over-exercising, often on an injury, those kinds of things. And so they develop a capability, an acquired capacity for lethality through that route. So there's many ways to develop a capacity for lethality. I think of it almost as like a bucket, And we all have events that go in this bucket over our lives. And so sometimes it's even if when you've been a victim of violence, that loads this lethality bucket a little bit less than if you're a perpetrator of violence. But a victim of violence, substance use, especially if you use IV drugs, eating disorder, military, police officer. You could start to put things in this bucket that start to increase your capability. So there's not much you can do with what's already in this bucket. You can't undo. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, but we can start to put a lid on the bucket, and we can prevent other behaviors, activities that may add to this. Drug use is one. Self-harm is a really good example that adds loads into this acquired capacity for lethality. So an important aspect to recognize with this, and this is where our radar should be up, let me say that, for in our clients, when we're in our teams, when we're looking at their capability for death by suicide, we're going to be wanting to look at what's in their acquired capacity bucket that may be promoting their ability to, or increasing their pain tolerance and decreasing their fearlessness around death. Something important to point out is that these are not sequential. So it's not that you develop a desire first, and then through this desire, you develop a capability. These can develop in any order and asynchronously. So the capability of suicide can come first. You may have always had this capability, and then on top of that, you become depressed, and you've now developed a burdensomeness and disconnectedness on top of an already present capability. Or it could be that you have a desire, and over time you develop a capability, and then become have that acquired capacity for lethality. So this conceptualization can be very helpful in understanding the client in front of us and the risk factors that they're experiencing and where we may be able to intervene. So we'll want our ears to be perked, listening for things around psychache, burdensomeness, disconnectedness, fearlessness around death. And so that will inform some of our interventions, but also the individual's risk for suicide. Okay, so the next part that I want to go into is the family safety and stabilization plan. So I talked a little bit about this at the beginning, that this is something that we utilize actually for all of our clients. And so this isn't just something we use for teens, and it's not something that we just use for clients who are struggling with suicidality. There's a version that you can use just around responding to your loved one in terms of de-escalation. So throughout the next two sections, I'm going to be using Sam as a case study. Sam's name has been changed, and some of her identifying information has been changed to protect confidentiality. So Sam is a 15-year-old female, her pronouns. She admitted to our partial hospitalization program after a hospitalization for a suicide attempt. She had attempted suicide by overdosing on Tylenol. She told her mom after she had overdosed, and then mom took her to the hospital. It's important when you are assessing individuals to get an understanding of their suicide attempts for a couple of reasons. The first is to determine if there's an increase in lethality with each suicide attempt. So for instance, if with the first suicide attempt, someone overdosed on, Benadryl or Vistaril, And they then told their mom, versus someone who attempted to hang themselves, and they fell, and their mom heard and came in and rescued them. There's always a protective factor when you see that a client went and told someone versus being found, or if the attempt was self-aborted versus interrupted. So these are things that you'll want to assess as part of the assessment process to get a picture of the degree of lethality that the client may have. So for Sam, she had attempted to hang herself when she was 13, which is a very lethal attempt. She fell in that process, but she went and she told her mom. She was hospitalized at that time. And then with this one, she overdosed on Tylenol and was hospitalized. And she had taken a full bottle of Tylenol, which is very serious, lethal attempt. But the fact that she told mom and was hospitalized immediately is a good sign as compared to if she was found by mom, etc. She lives with her parents. She has an older brother that went to college earlier in the year. This was a client we treated last year. And she has a dog named Rosie, who she's very connected to. So we put our ears perked up for this because pets can be a very powerful protective factor. And so this is a good sign that she has a good connection with Rosie. She also has a good connection with her brother, but when he went to college, this was something that was really difficult for her. She self-harms by cutting with razor blades, and she did require stitches earlier this year after self-harming. She abuses alcohol. She drinks with her friends 1 to 2 times a month on the weekends, and it's usually 5 or 6 beers, does get drunk, but not usually to passing out, although she did have an instance of passing out. She reports sexual abuse by a babysitter when she was 10, and she just revealed that while she was in the hospital. She experienced a lot of shame around this abuse. She had reported at the hospital, she hadn't shared this with her parents, but she felt like she saw, after she'd started being abused, that she sought it out with the babysitter, and had a lot of guilt around that, or shame around that she brought this on herself. There was something about her, she liked it, and felt very disgusted with herself around this. She had a boyfriend that she had broken up with her prior to the suicide attempt. They were now back together when she came to PHP. She has poor school performance and had been skipping school, and she did experience some bullying on social media. So this gives us a picture of Sam and how some of these things will be important as we talk about some interventions for her and the family safety plan. So our creation of the family safety plan, which you have with you in your handouts, and I'll share it here as well. It was influenced by the crisis support plan that Rudd and Brian developed in 2018, and Jobs's stabilization support plan. So we call it a stabilization plan, safety plan, interchangeably. This plan is created collaboratively with the client and the family member and the therapist. It becomes the family playbook on the best way to minimize a crisis and to divert a crisis, essentially. And developing this plan is preventive, like wearing a seatbelt or an insurance plan. So let me bring you with me to the plan here. You are welcome to utilize this plan or to edit it to your liking to make it apply to your clients. So the plan includes first some education about what the stabilization plan is. So this is what we give to families. We talk about creating a safe environment. So means reduction is a really important aspect of the family stabilization plan. Let me start with this. The number one way to prevent suicide, the most effective way, is reduction or limiting access to means. And so in the moment, this is the safest thing we can do. So, or the most effective way to prevent a suicide. So these are the things that we want to get in place for the family right away. So I'm going to go through this. So these are some of the means reduction aspects of this. And then it includes identifying crisis activators or suicidal activators, warning signs. And then we talk about the different components of the plan. I'm going to go through all of this. I'm just letting you see it here in the PDF, which you have. There's a face sheet. And we found that the best way to use the face sheet is kind of old school, which is having it posted on a refrigerator, a bulletin board, not electronically, not having it like in your phone. And so this face sheet has important contact information in terms of medications, the pediatrician, the pharmacy, therapist. This, if the client is at home, if the teen has to go to the hospital, taking this face sheet with you can be helpful to have all of this together. But then also having these numbers at your fingertips to call in case of an emergency. So that face sheet is good to have on a bulletin board or refrigerator, etc. Okay, and then this includes then some discussion points on the family's philosophy around safety. This should be discussed in family sessions. This is the plan around firearms, weapons, medications, and then other medications, other safety risk. And so we're going to go through this, the stages of a crisis, the distress thermometer, etc. So all of this is in your handouts. And again, you're welcome to use this. You can take off lightly the logo and use it to your heart's content. So, all right. So the first thing that we want to educate the family on is identifying risk. So the family safety plan corresponds to suicide risk levels. So it's easier for families and teens, and actually even adults, to, instead of talking about low risk, moderate risk, elevated, imminent, this is so clinical, we're going to talk about zones: green, yellow, orange, and red. And for our teens especially, this becomes shorthand for I'm in a crisis, I'm in the red zone. So this should be a sign to families when we start using this language. If Sam were to say to the family, I'm in the red zone, this is a drop everything. I want to kill myself. And this is either going to need to be de-escalated immediately or hospitalization may be necessary. The orange zone is more of associated with elevated risk, where the and we're going to identify what this looks like for Sam especially, but this is where they may have desire to kill themselves, but there is some safety so that they are not going to act on a plan. So this could be where we see clients a lot once we have this safety plan in place, where they are following the safety plan, even, and so they can stay out of the hospital while we're working on the suicidal desire. I'll pause there for a minute because I think this is an important time to say that hospitalization is right now one of is an effective intervention for creating safety, and it's a choice for those individuals at imminent risk, and often is the best choice. I say that though with a caveat, which is it is not an intervention to decrease suicidality. It's an intervention to create safety. So many of you, I go back to my old school training where we were trained hospitalization is the treatment. Hospitalization is a safety measure. And we need to understand that as clinicians for sure, but families need to understand that there's not going to be something magical done at the hospital where Sam says, oh my gosh, I've come to my senses. I no longer want to die. And it's important for the client to know that as well, because they often think that's what hospitalization is. And so it's not a mystery as to why suicides actually increase after hospitalization by 200%. That does not mean we don't send someone to the hospital. That still is the right thing to do, but it doesn't mean that they're out of the woods. So that's one of the things that I want to make sure is clear, is that when we're talking about hospitalization, it's the ultimate safety bubble, and it's often necessary until you can get stabilized, get sleep, get on good medications. And then the work around suicidality is going to be done at lower levels of care. And this is one of the things that I always want to make sure clients know, but especially our teams, is that we are going to work on this. I need you to be in a place of safety to do that. And that may require hospitalization if we can't achieve that safety. But I will not be sending you to the hospital to get you treated for suicidality. That's what we're going to do. So that's important for families to know as well, because they often haven't been educated on this. Clinicians haven't been educated on this, so why would they? And then we have the yellow zone, where this they may have ideation, but not really a plan. And when we look at the clinical interventions here, we'll be following de-escalation and safety plan, but we'll be assessing more informally. And then low risk, this is the green zone. And so this can become a time that when we look at this with families, this is like when things are going well. How do I know things are going well? What am I doing that is an indicator that things are going well? I'm doing things with my friends, or I'm taking my dog for a walk. And so that's this green zone. So we're going to talk about the family side of this in terms of how we equip families to identify these different areas on the thermometer, and how we equip them with interventions to help turn the heat down, so to speak, on the thermometer to get us back to yellow or green. So in your packet, the different components of this safety plan, the family safety plan, we've got our face sheet. We're going to help the family complete that. This is one of the first family sessions we do with clients, is get the face sheet completed, and then start on creating a safe environment. Because this is, again, remember, Sam's not out of the woods. Sam created safety at the hospital. Sam got sleep at the hospital. She got on a different medication at the hospital. But we still need to have safety in place and means reduction in place at home. So the first thing we do is create that safe environment. Then we've got the stages of the suicidal crisis. We'll talk about that. And then the last section of that safety plan are references and resources, websites for the family. So when we talk about means reduction, and notice that term, it's means reduction, not means restriction. In the field, we've moved away from the term restriction because what research has shown is that complete restriction of means is not necessary to reduce suicide risk. So we're not going to try to create an inpatient hospitalization environment at home, but there are things that we can do to reduce access to means. So what are things that we can lock up, or things that we can limit access, get rid of, and things that around medications where we can limit access. So these are things that you may, some examples here may be sharp objects such as knives, scissors, razors. You're going to see on the next page what Sam's family came back with. Sometimes families can go into overdrive on this. So they got rid of safety pins because they thought that would be helpful for her to not, in terms of self-harm. Safety pins are not going to be a typically lethal weapon. And so these are not things that we need to restrict. We're not trying to keep Sam from necessarily self-harming. We're going to be working on her self-harm, but we're trying to keep Sam from killing herself. Now, she did have some very serious self-harm incidents which required stitches. So people have self-harmed before where they've accidentally killed themselves. And so razors, knives, scissors, those things may be more appropriate to reduce access to. She did try to hang herself before, so we definitely want to limit access to ropes, extension cords, even belts, and cleaning products, and then substances. And this can include medications. I'll have families come in sometimes and say, okay, Susie wants to kill herself by shooting herself, so we got rid of all the guns. Our work is done. What I would say is that's great. And actually, when getting rid of guns is the best way to prevent death in the home. But what we also want to do here is we want to, even if Susie's never said, I want to use cleaning products, we want to limit access to those as well, because Susie may get creative now that she doesn't have access to means, if she doesn't have access to guns. So we want to create safety in other ways, even if it's not their method of choice. So you can see here, I talked about the face sheet already, but this is an example of the family safety plan that Sam and her family did, where they didn't have any weapons or firearms in the home. Brother is a hunter and has a rifle, but it's with him at college. And he's agreed that when he comes back home for the summer, that the gun would stay with grandparents instead of in the home. And then for medication, what they decided was that medications would be in a lockbox, that they're the only ones that have a key. Also seen families do a lockbox where it's a code, or and they are the only ones with the code. And then medications are provided to Sam by mom and dad. So since Sam overdosed on Tylenol, she's not administering her own medications at this time. They are administering her medications. So you see here what they came back with. They got rid of razors and scissors and kitchen knives. Those were also going to be locked up, but they also did safety pins. And so we'd said, it's going to be hard to limit access to safety pins. And then, we get into other sharp objects. So we did take that off when they came back in and said, let's focus more on really limiting access around these more lethal things, rather than spending energy on the less lethal things. And the family agreed to not have alcohol of any kind in the home. There are other families where this would not be something that felt doable. And so then these families may say they're just going to lock up alcohol so that there's not access. And the reason for this is that when Sam is suicidal, or when she drinks, she becomes more suicidal, not necessarily while she's intoxicated, but in the day after. And so that's one of the reasons that they really want her, not only because she's also 15, but to stay sober during this time. So in one of the family sessions, we identified risk factors and warning signs specific to Sam, and we did this together as a family. And so we looked at what Sam's risk factors were that preceded her previous attempt. And then we also looked at some of the warning signs. When we talk about warning signs, this is not to say, family, there were warning signs and you missed it. Bad job. Not at all. Often we didn't realize they were warning signs until after the fact. But now that we've had a suicide attempt, we now know these are warning signs. So we talk about this in a very compassionate way. This stance with families is very important. Families often feel like they already feel guilty. Just as parents, we feel guilty. But they feel like they're to blame, or that people are going to point the fingers. Therapists are going to say these are the things that you did wrong. So it's important to lead with compassion and definitely have conversation about why we're identifying these warning signs, not to point fingers, but more to be proactive moving forward. So these were some of the things identified for Sam. And some of the activators for Sam. So they talked about this as a family, and Sam was able to identify some of this herself, but then parents were able to interject as well and identify some of areas that were activators for her. Something else that Sam identified, because her parents had been using cell phone access as a punisher for alcohol use. And this is something that can be a powerful punisher, because this is something that is very valued by our teens. And so it was the only way they felt like they could get through to her. But what often happened is then she had no way, it was her main way of connecting. And, there's mixed experiences with connection through the phone and social media. And this can also be an activator for her, because there was times on social media people bullied her. But often the removing all access to social media isn't always possible, and isn't necessarily recommended as a punisher, because this can also be a main way of connection. Or if it is a punisher, not using it as, for the next 2 weeks, you can't have your phone. So we have to have other ways to achieve connection if that is a punisher that parents are wanting to use. All right, so the main meat of the stabilization plan is the distress thermometer. We use this in our facilities, at all of our facilities, residential, PHP, IOP, adults, and teens. And so with this, we also bring the family in so that they're able to start to apply this at home, either when the client comes home after residential or while the client is at home, when they go home during the day after their day treatment. So we help the client first identify for them. This is one of the first assignments they have: green, yellow, orange, and red, what that means to them. So green is no distress, yellow mild, orange moderate, and red severe. And so remember, that's that red zone where when I'm in that red zone, this is a very dangerous time. And if not addressed, can lead to a suicidal crisis. So the assignment that clients are given, and it's in your handouts, is this thermometer. And on the left side, they're supposed to describe how they present for each zone. This would include thoughts, feelings, symptoms, and triggers. Then on the right side, they're going to put ways that they cope and ways that people can support. So at treatment, this will be how staff can support. And at home, it would be obviously how family can support. This is a living, breathing document. So you'll see Sam's that you can tell she has different colors of pen because she started adding things while she was in treatment. So this is a picture of Sam's distress thermometer. And so at first, she just went through and identified thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and triggers for each zone and went over this with her therapist, and then also presented it in group. So one of the ways that we promote progress and momentum is that people share assignments like these and get feedback from their peers and from staff. So Sam did that, and you can see for her that she identified, I want to die, no one wants me here, this is the red zone. She'd added later is I should die. She feels overwhelmed, hopeless, angry, shame. Remember, this is something that had been coming up a lot related to that sexual abuse. Fights with her boyfriend, behaviors, self-harm, throwing things. So coping skills, deep breathing, and calling her mom. And then later through treatment, she was able to identify some other coping skills that really seemed to help. And so you see those sprinkled through here as she started learning other ways to identify her zones and ways to help. What I loved with this is Sam, at first, she knew more of things she didn't want people to do. And so she would say here, like her family often, when she was really distressed and got really overwhelmed, like at sort of a panic attack level, her mom especially would try to hug her, and that made her feel trapped. But she often would be so escalated she couldn't get words around it. So she'd said, don't try to hug me. So this can be helpful for families of what not to do. You can see later on, she was able to identify here when she's in moderate distress to turn off her social media. She found that she was able to get a rhythm with her social media, and times where it was helpful and times where it wasn't. And she could turn it off during times of distress during this moderate time. Also, this was good for her family. Don't tell me there's nothing to be upset about. when she's in moderate distress. So these were some things that she was able to add to. And I love some of the ones down here in the green zone. At first, she didn't have much here of skills that were that identified green zone, but she was able to over time realize, like when she's practicing gratitude, that's something that's indicative of the green zone. Taking Rosie for a walk every day, ways that people can support here, because often for our kids, because so much support is going on in these other zones, when things are going well, sometimes it's a little bit peace out from family, because they're like, oh, let's not talk about much because it might activate her. And so learning that there are times here I want to be asked how my day was. That was important for her. So this, as part of the family toolkit or the family stabilization plan, they were able to use this with Sam to start to identify in the moment what zone she was in, and where it was able to use this as a shorthand. So this also went on the refrigerator at home. Sam also had a picture of it in her phone. But this was a reminder for the family as to some of the things that they could do. So when Sam did start to escalate, things that they could do to sort of decrease the temperature. So some helpful tips for families or for therapists in working with families on this is, first, to be directive. Oftentimes we feel like families may want to have their own way of saying things, and it can feel sometimes too directive, or that we're being too forceful. Families, especially around these higher levels of escalation, families need scripts. And we all need scripts, actually. I don't know if you've been in these situations, like even this is why we role play with clients, that are at these higher levels of stress, of what you're going to say and how you're going to say it. So giving parents scripts is not artificial. It is something that can give them a place to start. They can make it their own over time. Also, use language that makes sense to the family system. Don't try to use, like, if the red, yellow, green, orange, if that doesn't work for the family, use something else. We don't need to fit them into our square peg round hole. We love to role play in the session. Families don't always like this at first. Kids don't like it at first, but this is something that we can make it fun. We can make it silly, and bring some humor to it at times. And when we first role play, we can be the parent, we can be the kid to create, an example. It looked like someone raised their hand. I don't know if that was real. Hold on. I don't even know how to check that. Well, I hope if you did raise your hand that it will, oh, okay, wait a minute, that we'll answer it at the end.
Yes, Nicole, we are saving the questions that are coming through, and we'll bring them back up at the end.
Okay, sounds good. So it might have been an accident when you raised your hand, but if you did, just hold on to it till the end and I'll answer. All right. So the next phase of what we're going to talk about today is how to coach the family on talking to their loved one, their teen, who's struggling with suicidality. No one gave us this script in what to expect when you're expecting, right? I don't know if people use that anymore, but like, how are you going to talk to your kid when they're suicidal? So we have to help families learn a language for how to respond. This is not innate. No one knows how to do this. This is not a skill set that families are equipped with. I love this quote, which is what is most detrimental to the mental health of a parent or caregiver is to witness a loved one suffering and feel helpless or ineffective in the face of it. Those of us who have children, it doesn't even have to be children. It can just be a loved one. You feel so helpless and inadequate. And our inclination is to want to fix it. And even as us as therapists, we want to fix it. We want to problem solve, even though we've been trained not to do that as therapists. When it comes to our loved ones, we move into problem solving. So it is counterintuitive for our families to do something different than starting with a problem solve. So emotion-focused family therapy was developed for eating disorders, for family members of clients with eating disorders. And it was to provide families with ways to support their loved one who was going through eating disorder treatment. And these interventions, though, have been found to be helpful with other types of presentations. And so we utilize these at our facilities. Our staff utilize these, but we train our families on how to use these as well. So emotion-focused family therapy was developed by Adele LaFrance in working with eating disorders to equip families on how to emotionally support their loved one. And it has influences from family-based therapy, motivational interviewing, emotion-focused therapy, circle of security, attachment-based family therapy. The foundations of EFFT is that it's very skills heavy. So it's based on the fundamental belief that difficulty with emotion processing is what is at the root of most mental health symptoms. And if we can help the person emotionally process, if we can be a conduit of that as the family member, we can de-escalate. EFFT skills are not needed necessarily for everyday good enough parenting. So these are not skills that most parents have been equipped with. It's not until your child may have mental health struggles that you need something like this. Now, once you know these skills, you'll find that you're applying them with your other kids that may not be struggling, or even in relationships in general. You may be applying them, but they wouldn't be needed necessarily with what LaFrance refers to, good enough parenting or kids that are thriving. So as part of this, parents or caregivers learn behavioral support, emotional support, and how to heal ruptures in the relationship. What we're going to focus on today is just the emotional support component. And this is what we focus on with our families. So the emotional support skill is emotion coaching. And it's a two-step process. The first, as part of this process, is validation. So we're going to communicate that we get what our teen is going through by providing evidence, 3 bullets of evidence, so to speak. And then we can provide emotional support or practical support. We are good at the emotional support and the practical support, and that's what we typically lead with as family members. But if we miss the validation, there's no place for that emotional or practical support to land. So we have to teach families how to do this validation for step 2 to work. So the core skill in emotion coaching is providing validation through becauses. We aren't going to use but. We're going to remove but from our vocabulary and to help our parents remove that from our vocabulary. So but often cancels out the validation. If you say, I know you must be sad, but there's so much to live for. Now, as therapists, we have a little trick, right? We've all learned the and. So we say, I know you want to kill yourself and you're so distressed, whatever. And there's so much to live for. And we think that we're, providing this balanced approach, but it's really a but in disguise. So we are not using buts or ands as part of the emotion coaching. We're using because. We're going to validate their emotional response, and then we're going to show why we get it. Because. Sort of Wizard of Oz. And what you can think about, I love this analogy that LaFrance uses, which is the emotion coaching elevator. So if you think about someone distressed, they're in that red zone, or maybe even the orange zone. They are at the top of the escalator, or the elevator, I should say. They're at that top floor. And you're trying to bring them down to the ground floor where action can occur. We often try to do that through support, but it doesn't work. They are too escalated, too elevated. So we start they're at this top floor, and we validate the emotion. I can imagine you can fill in the blank with what you think they might feel or what you'd feel in their shoes. I can imagine you might feel scared. And then you say, because it's your first time in treatment. And you come down a few floors to floor 19. And because you don't know anyone here yet. And because you're afraid if they get to see you, that the real you, that they're going to see your shame. Those are 3 becauses. That's an example of someone who might be admitting to a treatment program. And so you're validating their fear. What old school might have been to say, I can imagine you might feel scared, but you're going to meet these other kids and you're going to see that they're just like you, and it's going to feel good in a few days. That is old school. It's not validating. I just undid their fear. So we're going to validate their fear. That's one example. So here's I didn't realize that my next example uses something like going to treatment as well. I know you feel sad that you have to go to treatment, but this is old school, but it's what your therapist thinks is best for you right now. It's all going to be okay. Instead, you'd say, it makes sense you're feeling anxious about starting treatment because it's your first time and you don't know what to expect, because it feels lonely to be disconnected from your friends, and because being away from home and your family feels unbearable. So those are some becauses just for first day of treatment kind of thing. I start to, over time, drop the becauses because it feels a little bit stilted. At first, though, families are going to need to do the becauses. Otherwise, they're going to slip into buts and slip into fake buts of ands. So we're going to use those becauses at first, even though it might feel stilted. And then after you have provided validation, then you can provide the emotional support where you say, I see how hard this is, and I'm proud of you. I believe in you, and I will be here every step of the way. You don't have to do this alone. So we're not leading with that. That's after the validation. So some helpful tips for families is, we're conditioned to view the behavior as the problem and respond without considering the driving emotional force. So we have to get to that driving emotional force first. We also tend to validate only what we think is true. And so I'm going to talk about this around suicidality in a second. And that is, that can be difficult for families because they don't want to validate that their child feels suicidal. They may feel like it may make things worse. And we tend to validate by first offering support, which that should come second. Most important thing, we do not have to agree with whatever we're validating. It's not required. It doesn't have to be true, even what we're validating. We're validating their experience. The other thing to think about is that this is not a miracle intervention. We're just looking for a little shift, a 1 degree shift. And over time, that becomes 2 degrees, 3 degrees. So what we'll see is that by integrating these skills, that is additive, and we see more change over time, not necessarily right in that moment. So how do we validate suicide? This gets very tricky for families, sometimes even clinicians. So I feel very comfortable saying to someone, I understand that you feel suicidal. That does not make someone more suicidal. And I can say, because I can just do the risk factors that we talked about before, because you feel so burdensome carrying the weight of that psych ache, and because you feel all alone and misunderstood, and because it feels like it's never going to get better. I've not just said that this person needs to kill themselves. I've said I understand why they feel the way that they do. Families sometimes don't even want to say, I understand you feel suicidal. And that feels risky at first until they get used to the language. So what we're really validating is hopelessness. That feels scary too, because it feels, to validate someone's hopelessness, we have to go into the cave with them. So here's a dad outside the cave. They're going into the cave with their teen, and then validating, which allows to come out of the cave of hopelessness. So a script might look like this. I can't do this anymore. I just want to die. So what we can say is we're going to validate the hopelessness, but be behind that. I can understand that you feel hopeless because you've been struggling for a long time, and because you may not see the light at the end of the tunnel, and it may not feel like anyone gets it and just how bad this feels. Then you can provide support on the tail end. It could be emotional support. I don't know how, when, where, but I believe it will get better. And you're not alone in this. I'm here for you and I love you so much. Practical support can be, why don't we take Rosie for a walk together? Or why don't we get on the couch and watch a movie together? So we first have to validate before we intervene behaviorally. So this, I've got this in the resources as well. But there is a very good book for families around this. Hold on, let me get it off my bookshelf. I always forget the name of it. So this can be, the book is What to Say to Kids When Nothing Seems to Work. This is the book on emotional coaching. And so this is by Adele LaFrance. And so this can be good for families. Okay, so we first work on coaching, and then that is a very important family intervention. What we then want to look at are interventions for teens that we'll be doing in individual therapy. So we've got the family piece. We've coached families on how to interact with their loved one. We have the family safety plan in place. What are we doing in individual sessions? The model that we use here at Lightfully, we call it the precision care model. And what I like to say is that this is powered by process-based therapy. So this is just our version of process-based therapy, which is the Hayes and Hoffman approach to an integrated evidence-based approach to treatment. If you're not familiar with process-based therapy, I highly recommend reading some of the links that are here, because this is the wave of the future. Instead of a disorder, a product by disorder approach, the wave of the future is integrating the effective ingredients from all evidence-based modalities and applying those based on the needs of the client. So as part of this model, we look at what the drivers are behind mental health symptoms, and then we integrate and apply evidence-based interventions accordingly. So when we talk about drivers, it's important to understand the difference or what a driver is, and that we have negative drivers and positive drivers. So negative drivers are what is underneath the surface of the symptoms. So when we just focus on symptoms, for Sam, let's say, if we were just focusing on her self-harm and her suicidal ideation and said, that's what we're really going to work on, let's have some interventions that decrease self-harm, we are missing what's driving that self-harm, because Sam may self-harm because she hates herself, whereas Susie may self-harm as a way to emotionally regulate. We need to know what it is for Sam. So what are her negative drivers? We need to identify those, and then we need to intervene accordingly. We also have positive drivers, so we need to know what those are for clients. And so these are things like emotion flexibility and acceptance, living in accordance with your values, mindful self-compassion, connection with others. So we'll be promoting these positive drivers through treatment while interrupting negative drivers. The precision care model or process-based therapy is a three-step approach. The first step is comprehensive assessment. So we first need to get a lay of the land. We need to understand what are the symptoms, what are the drivers for this individual. This includes symptom checklists like the PHQ-9, but also measures of drivers. So measures of self-compassion, measures of emotion dysregulation, measures of values alignment. Based on this, we develop a personalized case conceptualization, and then we apply interventions accordingly. Part of the assessment that we do with our clients with suicidality, those clients at higher suicide risk, is from the CAMS approach. So this is understanding, this is one of the first interventions in the CAMS approach, for the first assessment. It's assessment and intervention. It's identifying what the person's drivers are. Why are you suicidal? What is it that is making you want to kill yourself? What Jobs has identified through his research is that there's four main drivers, and it is emotion dysregulation, self-hate, disconnection, and stressors, like financial stressors, relationship stressors, that kind of thing. So we did this with Sam. And so here we were able to identify her specific thoughts. I should die. No one wants me here. This will never get better. There's something wrong with me. I'm a failure. I can't handle this. Here are feelings. Here are the behaviors. Here are the themes. And through this, we were able to identify her top two drivers of suicidality. And it was self-hate and shame, and what she referred to as big feelings, like when she would get very overwhelmed in her feelings. And so we can also think about this from clinically as emotion dysregulation. And if you're thinking about a treatment plan and what you're addressing, these could be the two other problems on the treatment plan. Problem one, obviously, is suicidality. Problem two, self-hate. Problem three, big feelings. So the second step in the precision care model formula is a case conceptualization. So this is, we got a lay of the land. Now we have a formulation. So we would say client symptoms of suicidal ideation, self-harm, drinking, are driven by this is suicidal ideation we have here, are driven by self-hate and emotion dysregulation. So the third step then is selecting interventions based on these drivers. We did not come up with these interventions. These are those interventions identified by Hayes and Hoffman as the effective ingredients across all evidence-based modalities. So if you were to look at DBT, CBT, EMDR, all of these alphabet soups, if you were to distill them down into their effective ingredients, they all have a little mindfulness, they all have a little acceptance, they all have a little compassion-focused interventions, they all have some motivational enhancement. These are those ingredients identified, and there's 13 of them. And so, like I said, the wave of the future is getting trained in these interventions rather than play-by-play evidence-based modality in just one arena, say CBT or DBT. So this is how we train our clinicians. And so for Sam, I've identified for her, we've got her big feelings. So we're going to use interventions that match big feelings: arousal reduction, mindfulness, emotion regulation, acceptance. And then for self-hate, we've got our compassion-focused interventions and modification of negative core beliefs. So these are the interventions that we'd be pulling from. So let's talk about what that looks like in action and what we did with Sam. So we're back on the distress thermometer. This is one of the best interventions that you can do with clients with emotion dysregulation. So we already identified the distress thermometer of what this looks like for her, what some of her coping skills are. But you can take some of the DBT skills, the distress tolerance skills, and paste them onto the distress thermometer of which ones work best for which level. So up at the top, we started practicing these with Sam: stop skills, tip skills, which includes temperature, intense exercise, paced breathing, progressive muscle relaxation. She really liked the temperature change, like putting her face in ice really was helpful when she was at that really high level of distress. And so then we can kind of move down the scale of other DBT skills that might be appropriate for each level. So it's important to have clients try these on for which ones work best for them. And so we did that with Sam. We also did some work with Sam around her window of tolerance. And so we pulled this from polyvagal theory, looking at what her optimum window of arousal was. She had a very narrow window of tolerance. Most of our teens do. Most of our clients do, but definitely teens have a narrow window of tolerance in or out of treatment. And so how do we start to build that window of tolerance? How do they know when they're in hyperarousal, hypoarousal? And what are things that we can do to pull her back into that window of tolerance? And she was able to identify being with her dog is something that really widens her window. That's a time that she feels connected. That's in her optimal zone. Connection with others. Also, was able to identify more glimmers. This is from polyvagal theory of little identifiers through the day that are indicative of regulation. We also did some work with her around self-compassion, and specifically around, she had a very strong inner critic. And I use the term inner critic. You can use a term that speaks. She liked that term, so they used that. But other people can use some IFS terms, like your manager. You can use terms that speak to you. But getting to know the things we used here for her, we're getting to know her inner critic, building her compassionate self, and practicing self-compassion. Some of the most important work that I think you can do with any client, but especially clients that struggle with self-compassion, is getting to know your inner critic and the protective function it serves. So this is from IFS, recognizing that the inner critic is protective. It developed for a reason, and it's learned from experience. It's keeping you in line. It's keeping you safe. And so often it gets very bossy, and it can get very critical as part of that. And it may or may not be based in truth, but it can feel very threatening to your internal system to go after your inner critic and start trying to restructure those thoughts or to stop those thoughts. So an alternative approach, rather than some of that classic cognitive restructuring, is to identify the purpose that inner critic serves. And it has to be tired. It's been doing this work for a long time. And there's some other ways that we can create some protection in addition to that manager part, so to speak. So we talk about building the compassionate self. Again, some of this is from compassion-focused therapies, but also from IFS, looking at those 8 C's of self. I love doing this work with clients because this is also an indicator when you're in self. This is outside of those manager, firefighter, exiled parts, if you're familiar with IFS. And it is it's an integration of those, and it is the orchestra, the conductor of that orchestra. How do you know you're in self? If you're operating from a place of curiosity, clarity, all of these C's: compassion, confidence, courage, connection, calm. And so often a gateway into self is through curiosity. So starting curious, this can be a way to get us into compassion, because remember, compassion can feel threatening to that inner critic. And so other ways that we can get into self is through curiosity. And that, I always say, curiosity holds hands with compassion. And then this was something that really worked well with Sam, was using compassionate imagery. And so she was able to use, this is from compassion focused therapy, and she was able to use a compassionate image. I have here a little fairy godmother, but she was actually able to use an image of her grandmother who had passed away. And she would say to herself, what would my grandmother say in this situation? And she could access that sometimes. And her inner critic didn't feel as threatened by some of the things that her grandmother would say. And so those could be held together. And so she could talk to herself sort of from that grandmother voice. So we did a lot of work, or they did a lot of work around building that image, accessing that image, especially in that orange zone for her. And then we practice self-compassion. I love Kristen Neff's work around self-compassion is a practice. It is not a trait. It's not that you have self-compassion or you don't. You just practice it and build it. So when clients say, I don't have this, of course you don't. You haven't practiced it. We're going to start a self-compassion practice with you. So this includes 3 steps: mindfulness, self-kindness, and connection to others. And so breaking this down is mindfulness is just even being able to identify, I'm feeling really anxious right now. And how can I be kind to myself? And this might be active kindness or self-talk. And then reminding myself that I'm connected to other people that may have similar ways of being. This is part of the human condition. I'm not in this boat alone. And so that 3-step process and practice was something that that we practiced on with Sam. All right. So in summary, teens struggle with suicidality. Families can help de-escalate and create safety. Addressing drivers behind suicidal desire is essential in decreasing risk. And the integration of a variety of evidence-based intervention is where we get the most bang for our buck in working with teens. And like I said, today is a message of hope. There is hope for addressing suicide early, especially when these teens are getting treatment early on. We are creating pathways, new neuronal connections that pave the way for them as adults. I have a video that I want to share, just a hopeful video, and then we'll have time for questions. right. Well, there is the UR code if you QR code. Sorry, I'm thinking UR, utilization review. QR code if you want to use that to get your handouts and the slide deck. And we have some time for questions.
Excellent. So go ahead and pop your questions into the chat here whenever you're ready. We did get a couple while we were in the meeting. So I'll start with this first one. I'm going to pop this in right now so you can see it, Nicole.
Okay.
Can you explain the difference between having a plan and having a loose plan?
Oh, yes. Yes. So loose plan would be more like I'm going to overdose. I have a plan, but I haven't really worked out all of the details, which would, if a firm plan would be, I have saved up my medicine, I've stockpiled my medication, and it's in my nightstand, and I am going to overdose tonight.
Thank you. This one was from Tiffany. How does self-injurious behavior related to coping skills of neurodivergent individuals or as a maladaptive way to stop spiraling depression thoughts?
This is a great question. So self-harm is tricky because clients will often report that it decreases their suicidality in the moment. So sometimes when they're really heightened, they're in that red zone, self-harm is a coping skill that kind of decreases that urgency around wanting to kill themselves. And so there is it's a coping skill. It works in that way, the same way it might to take a shot of alcohol. And so we need to acknowledge that. At the same time, there is some risk in self-harm as a behavior in terms of acquired capacity, because over time, self-harm adds to your acquired capacity for lethality. So in talking about this with clients, this can be something to say, like, in the moment, this might serve you well because it decreases some of those that urgency, but in the long run, this is going to be something that's actually making things worse. Some of that is difficult with teens. They're very present focused, and the long-term consequences can be more difficult to discuss, and that can be true also with clients with neurodivergence. And so having some real tangible examples, like we often use like a DBT timeline of what you were feeling before, after, what were the things that led up to it, and then what were some of those consequences, short-term and long-term. So using that, the DBT chain analysis can be really helpful of having something more tangible than just talking about it circumstantially.
Excellent. Okay, I know we're at time here, so I do want to thank you, Dr. Siegfried, for a wonderful presentation. I've been reading the comments and it sounds like the group found this quite insightful. So thank you so much.
Well, I also saw that they loved the video. This was there's a website called Gives Me Hope, and I compiled this several years ago. This is on that website of different ways, different stories of hope so that were contributed. So I took those from the website and compiled a video. So I'm glad you liked it.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And again, this will be available online as a recorded video.